and welcome back to Ashley Main Makes, and today we are making not one, but two skirts. So if you've been following along here, you'll know that I've been really trying to crank on my work wardrobe, and so I thought, in the spirit of that, why not make two skirts out of the same pattern? Now, both of these skirts are actually inspired by the fabric they're made out of. The first one is actually some beautiful Ralph Lauren dead stock that I have previously purchased and has been sitting around for quite a while from Fabric Mart. And it's been sort of waiting for the perfect project. So I really wanted to make something more Ralph Lauren inspired out of it. So when the Charm Patterns uniform skirt came out from Gertie's Patreon, I decided it was the thing with the big buttons down the front. So I got some big, beautiful tortoiseshell buttons and decided to basically make the skirt as is for this version. Except, of course, I can't leave the waistband alone as per usual, and I did a little elastic back hack. I know Patreon's a little bit annoying for people, but I've definitely done a lot of these hacks on a bunch of my other skirts, so I think this is quite a detailed video to get into all those hacks. Like I say, I've done this elastic back hack before, actually in the fall. I did it on my Halloween skirt, which was a big 4 pattern. So, you know, this is something I do a lot, and so I think there's still a lot of value for you guys to get out of it, even if you don't make this exact pattern. So yeah, so there's that version, which I was really excited about, and then the second version is actually also inspired by its fabric, which is some vintage, true vintage 70s fabric, which is a poly rayon blend, so an absolutely very different drape from the Ralph Lauren fabric. And it's actually from Stephanie Canada, which is also here on YouTube, and if you don't follow her, that would be kind of weird, but I'll leave her channel down below, as well as her website at Backroom Finds, which is where I got the fabric. So because of this, and because it's a little bit lighter and a little bit drapier, more like a suiting, I decided that it would be nice to omit the buttons and just kind of let the plaid shine. And so I've also done inseam pockets. I did the waistband. I also did an elastic back hack on this waistband, but I'm constructing this waistband more like how I have been lately with the band roll and putting the elastic in the back. So it is very crispy and very nice, and I'm very excited about how it turned out. So with all that being said, let's get into the making of these two very different skirts.
All right, so we are going to go ahead and kick it off with actually doing that elastic back hack. So all I'm doing here is actually separating my front pieces from my back pieces. Gertie does her waistbands as one continuous piece. So I'm actually just cutting it at the notches where it matches on the side seam to be able to separate this front piece from, or the front pieces rather, from the back waistband. And then I'm just tracing the width of the back waistband to give me some extra length to play with. Now, off camera, I actually measured that skirt piece that you can see there. So I've actually measured the width of that pleat to be able to add that to the back here. I just had to take the nasty tape off this piece because this is actually where you tape it together when you're taping the pattern together. So just disregard that, but I'm taping it back onto my extra length that I added. And then I'm going to add 2 times that length that I measured to account for the 2 pleats in the back. And I'm just marking that line on there and cutting a little bit extra so that I can actually tape the pieces back together. So, and lining it up on that line, of course, and giving it a good tape. And that is actually all there is to it. Now, I'm just not going to add that pleat when I go to make the skirt. Like, I'm not going to sew that pleat in the back. So it will just be lightly gathered in the back, but I think that's perfectly acceptable. And then here, I'm just adding back my seam allowance. So remember, when you cut one piece into 2 pieces, you need to add back your seam allowance. So seam allowance in this case is 5/8, which I really like because that's kind of the standard that I learned how to sew with. So, you know, makes it really easy for my brain with these Gertie patterns. Honestly, it's part of the reason I like them. But yeah, so doing the same thing on the front piece as well, just making sure that we've got that 5/8, and then I don't accidentally take some length off my waistband where that would make the skirt smaller and that would be bad. So, and also just making sure I mark that piece because the label was on the center, and using the awl to mark out where the buttons actually go. So I'm actually just showing you the cutting of the plaid skirt. I'm not going to show you the cutting of the other because it's just sort of redundant. But cutting on plaids is actually kind of complicated. It's more just annoying than anything. So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to line up the skirt as best as I can with the center of one of the stripes. It was a little tricky because the blue is only ever so slightly lighter than the navy, so I was having trouble seeing, so I kind of marked it out. And then I lined up the skirt on that line, and then I've got it held down with my pattern weights here, and I'm using my electric scissors, which is so much fun. These are amazing for when you have to cut out giant pieces like this, so they are my favorite thing for cutting skirts, because it makes it so much faster and makes my arm hurt so much less. So this gives me the first half of the skirt here. So we're actually going to jump over to where I've got it folded over on itself. And the goal of what I'm trying to do here is to actually match up the plaid so that you can't tell any difference between like your cut piece and your piece underneath. So that this way it'll be like a perfect mirror image panel. And it'll be lined up nice and smooth and even. So this does take a little bit of time, obviously, to match it all up perfectly as well as you can. But it does give you a really nice, clean result that I think looks a lot more professional. So, you know, especially if you're only working with something that is very simple like this, where you're only cutting out a couple pieces, I think it makes sense to try and have this level of detail. But I did notice very shortly here, when I come down this one side, that I am not quite lined up there at the top, if that's been annoying anybody. And what's actually happening is the fabric is trying to fall off the table, and I try and correct it here with a bleep ton of fabric weights, but it doesn't go that well. I try and like re-line it up because I've already got it half cut at this point, and that was a bit of a fail. So you can see I'm like trying to yank it back onto the table there to get it to not have as much weight on it so I can line it back up again. So doing my absolute best. So I'm actually going to go ahead and cut the second panel on the floor after this. I'm cutting 2 of the identical, technically back of the skirt to make my front and back on the plaid. So yeah, so I cut the other one off camera on the floor where it wasn't trying to fall off the table. So right here, I'm actually jumping over to one of the details on the navy skirt, which is the belt loops. And actually she has kind of an interesting construction here where she basically folds in each side. I did try and do this as a loop and it didn't work in this thickness of fabric. Probably if you had thinner fabric, it would work. But anyway, you fold in both sides and finish both sides. And then I'm just top stitching. And then actually what you do is you take this one long belt loop and cut it into your individuals. So this is actually hugely time saving and I kind of love this idea. I've mostly done belt loops on Big 4 actually, and they don't have you do that. They just have you do them individually, and this is much better and makes them a lot more even. And then here I'm actually putting in my pleat. So the way I like to do these box pleats is to actually sew the pleat in place. And then I'll unfold it and like try and iron it flat. So then that way your pleat is really solidly in there and it doesn't come unfolded and you don't end up with like a little gap at your pleat when you try and attach these to your waistband. So I don't undo this little bit of basting stitch until the very final thing, but it just allows me to get a really clean kind of seam into my waistband without having like any weird kind of stretching or little gaps in my box pleat that I found I often had when I didn't do this. So it's just kind of a guarantee for you for everything to be tight and nice and even, and then also like preventing your waistband from stretching out of shape. So I'm just going ahead and marking where my belt loops are. That was kind of one thing I didn't take account in this whole process, and she didn't really have a good way of marking it. So I've just gone ahead and like basically divided it in thirds for this like longer back waistband. We're eventually going to have the elastic. And the front waistband was marked, but it was corresponded with the actual pleats themselves, and I think I forgot to mark it, so I just kind of did that after the fact, which, you know, what do you call it? Do as I say, not as I do. So, but definitely. But yeah, I actually really love this effect because this gives you the belt loops over the elastic. So if you did actually want to wear a belt over this, so that you wouldn't even be able to tell then that you had an elastic back. So you just have all the comfort of the elastic back, and you could just have like kind of a loose belt over top and you wouldn't even see it. So that's the kind of nice part about this. And now we're into the kind of front. I would call this a slash pocket, but it's like a round slash pocket. And of course, Gertie, attention to detail. She already has the interfacing in here, so she does actually have a pattern piece for the interfacing that matches this curve, which I think is a lovely detail. I do that anyway when I'm doing my own slash pockets, so it's nice to see it included in the actual pattern. And the keen eye of you will actually note that this is a scrap of walkaway dress fabric that I had left over, so that's a bunch of fun. If you haven't seen that video of mine, I'd be sort of shocked, but I'll leave it up above. Most of you are following me from there, but I'll leave it up above. It's a bit of fun, but that's where this fabric came from. And so all along here, I've been actually just working on doing some understitching here just to keep that pocket nicely in place so that that yellow doesn't poke out at all and the pocket looks nice and crisp. And that just gives me a nice result, even on that curve. It was a little tricky trying to get it like super smooth while I was trying to sew that curve, but it really wasn't that bad. And then I'm laying the back of the pocket bag over flat, and you're going to say, Ashley, that's not how you're supposed to do that. But really what I'm doing here is just pinning it that way so that it's flat when I put it on and my side seam lines up really well. Because I've had sometimes where my side seam like kind of is out of place a little bit. The angle is slightly off, and then that wrecks the size of where your waistband is. You know, it might end up being like a 1/4 inch on either side, and then your waistband size is out of whack. So it's really important to get that right. So simple way to fix that is just by laying it over top and pinning it that way before you like flip it around or do anything weird. And because even if your pockets are a little bit off, then I'd rather my pocket be a little bit off on the inside than that line be a little bit off on the outside. So we're just coming all the way around that pocket on the inside, and then I'm not kind of worried about that side until we go to baste it here, which is what I believe I'm doing. So just basting that top half in place, and then basting that side in as well so that it's nice and smooth, so that we can go and attach this basically like it's one panel to the back skirt, like pockets never happened. And it's the great thing about doing kind of a slash pocket like this is because, you know, if you did want to put in a zipper on the side, like a side zip, these pockets don't interfere with anything. They look really nice. And I actually find like the forward placement of them a little bit is actually a lot more comfortable to put my hands in, which, yes, I shouldn't be sticking my hands in a pocket. No, I'm not a lady. It's fine. Yeah, so we're jumping on over. I'm actually sewing on the placket here. So you can see that I've serged all these pieces. I did that off camera as well because I knew this was going to be a long one already with doing 2 different skirts. So I saved you that. It's not that exciting to watch me serge a bunch of pieces. But what I'm doing here is I'm actually ironing it flat out first, like flattening, like ironing it flat on my seam allowance, and I find that just helps before I fold it over like this, that you're actually getting right into the corner and that you're not losing any side of the skirt that way, if you know what I mean. Like you're not getting anything tucked up in the inside before you iron. So again, gives you a nice, really crispy result. I hate to say it, but half of good sewing is ironing. I sound like my Nana, but you know, the unfortunate reality is it's true the longer I get into this, especially when you're working on something that's more structured like this. All right, so waistband time. We got waistbands incoming. So Gertie's waistbands are 2-part waistbands. You could, of course, cut these double the width if you did really want to and skip this seam in here. I do find this is kind of nice for construction. I do like doing them this way when I'm doing the band roll or the elastic, because you kind of almost use the seam allowance to hold those things in place. But to each his own. And if, like I say, if I'm short on fabric, sometimes I just do it like on the fold as a fold. Favorite green skirt that I always reference is done that way, where it's just like one double wide waistband. The cool thing about, I think the other thing I like about Gertie Patterns is like her usual waistband is like a finished 1.5 inches. So, and I think that's a great size actually on like the great majority of people look good in an 1.5 inch waistband. I think it's quite a flattering, like it's not too high where you're like encroaching on what little waist space I have. And it's not too small that it looks like disproportionate. So that's really good. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually basting the bottom of the waistband closed like it was finished. So we're going to do a bit of a different technique here. This is a technique I tried out on the Friday Pattern Company's Saturday Skirt Set skirt. This is kind of how they do their skirt. So what they have you do is make a finished kind of elastic tunnel. So here I'm trying, actually in vain, which I'll find out later, to guesstimate how much elastic I need in the back of my skirt. I think that's the only major flaw in this method, is like it's hard to know how tight you need the elastic, and both times that I've done this now I don't have the elastic tight enough, so I might have to go in and fix it. I got it close on this one, but I don't know. It might be one of those things where you might want to measure and slowly figure it out over time. I just haven't figured it out yet. Basically on how tight I like my elastic. I like my elastic pretty tight because I'm like perpetually carrying my phone around in my pocket or my keys. And so I don't want my waistband or my skirt to be pulled down by having those things in my pockets, because I put big pockets in for a reason, to hold lots of stuff. So here I am just working the elastic through with a big safety pin. That's still the best way to put in an elastic as far as I'm concerned. I've tried all the tools at this point and that's still the best. So what I'm trying to do is just create a nice little flat end there before I sew it on. So we're just kind of actually gonna, again, baste it to finish it off. And so I have like a whole completed waistband with the elastic in it already, and you can see it sitting right there. And now I'm going to assemble my front pieces. I did go ahead and use regular interfacing on these ones just because I was doing this method. I don't think this would really work with the band roll if you were going to try that, which is kind of the other stabilizer that I'll show you in a minute. You'll see what it looks like and why that doesn't make sense. But so I'm just using regular old-fashioned interfacing, and so I'm just sewing that top seam again and that corner. So I'm trimming that corner off and just finishing it off with some fray check. I find that really helps when I go to turn out the corner, and so that like I don't poke the corner out, so it gives you a really strong corner. And then what I'm doing is I'm sandwiching that elastic waistband in between my front waistbands here. So you'll see that it's like right side to right side, which is pretty obvious with the interfacing there. And then putting some pins in that space that I created where I sewed the waistbands on, and then I'll sew that together. And what that does is that gives you actually a really smooth waistband on the inside. So that allows you to finish off the whole waistband essentially. So we're going to do the same thing here, just trim off the excess and hopefully put on some fray check, which we were having difficulties with the fray check. But there you go. And you can see how that flips out. So all your seam allowance is hidden inside. It's a little stiffish because we got that interfacing in there. So I'll iron that flat once the stuff dries and we poke that corner out. But you can see how smooth that creates it. Now, the only issue with this is that obviously then you have to finish all the way around in the waistband itself on the inside, or do something else with it because you can't tuck your seam allowance up into the waistband. So, I don't know, mixed bag. I mean, it is a really easy way of finishing an elastic waistband like this. It is pretty crisp. I am going in and adding a little bit of top stitching right along the top edge because I really kind of wanted that. I kind of wanted the top stitch look on this one. I don't think I actually added enough of it in the end. But just to kind of add to that Ralph Lauren-y look, I kind of wanted the top stitching on these front waistband pieces. So, and that'll keep it nice and flat too when it goes through the wash. It'll stay nice and crisp, because the less ironing I have to do after I'm done the project, the better off I am. So, I really don't like to iron stuff for every day, but I will iron it while I'm making it. So, now, here's the kind of pain in the butt method of doing this part, is that now I have to try and figure out how to pin this in place while the elastic's already in there and make it smooth and line it up in such a way that we have an equal amount of elastic and tube in each area. So it requires a lot of stretching and a lot of like quadrant pinning. Like I'm going to start off with pinning my side seams and work around from there. And then once we've got that finally in there, this is going to look really crazy here in a minute. I've actually got the whole skirt actually over my left shoulder while I'm doing this so that I can keep it out of the way. And then I'm going to creep up to my elastic here, just like sewing like normal. And then I'm going to give it a good pull and hold it in the back there so that I can hold it taut and hold it flat, so that I'm trying to eliminate how many wrinkles I'm getting. I might still get some wrinkles. I did get a couple, but I did pretty well on this. So just kind of holding it and stretching it. You do have to be careful. As you can see, I just like totally ran over some pins there. And I definitely broke a needle doing this, just because it's hard to take your pins out as you're holding everything taut. So it is a bit of a risk, but you know, I don't know, risk equals reward or something like that. So there I am, just undoing those basting stitches now that my waistband is all in place. And I also realized I could finish off this top seam as well, where that facing was at the front of the skirt where the buttons go. So I realized I could also tie that in and make that a clean corner. So I went ahead and did that. And then I'm going ahead and just serging off basically that waistband connection. Like I say, you have to finish it off in some manner if you use this method of construction. So that part's slightly annoying. You can use bias binding as well. I've done that before. Even twill tape, I think to a certain extent you could use. So, you know, really anything you've got handy, but you do have to try and finish it off in some manner. And I don't think overcasting on your machine makes the most sense. So this is actually a few days later. I've actually had it hanging for several days because it is a 3/4 circle skirt, so you will want to let it hang and stretch. It didn't stretch a ton given this fabric is pretty stiff, but it did stretch enough. And then I actually had my partner try and chalk hem it for me. So this is actually quite a while later. And then all I'm doing here is trying to put my front together for my buttons. Now, because again, this is an elastic back skirt, I didn't really want to put any real buttons in because I didn't want the real buttons being stressed by being under the pulling of the elastic. So I decided I would just go ahead and sew these directly onto the skirt. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just actually, you'll see the magic of this in a minute. But I'm just putting my buttons on my skirt. I've got it pinned together on either side of the button. And I'm actually going to sew all these buttons on with my machine. So here you can see me doing a test on a scrap of fabric I had, where I am just annoyingly trying to get my foot onto my button. There is specialty button feet for doing this, but I never do it that way. I just do it with my regular foot. But basically the essence of this is you center the foot over your buttonhole and you figure out what the width is between the two holes in the buttons. And then you just fire away and go back and forth. And then I'll go up and down a couple of times just on the one side and double check. So once you get going on this, this goes really quite fast. And since this skirt had so many buttons, it was definitely worth setting it up. So 1, 2, and then firing away with my foot pedal, and then just up and down like a straight stitch on the one side. So it gives you a really clean way of doing a button. It's a really strong way of putting on a button. So I don't know if I would do this if I was actually like using these buttons to undo them ever, but I'm using them to permanently hold this skirt closed, and I don't want one to pop open and have my belly show or poke out, so we're just doing it this way. And the tape holds the button in place while I do this. I usually use the hand crank first just to make sure I've got it lined up, actually, just in case, again, so I don't smash a needle. And I decided to leave off the very last button there. I just, I don't think I needed it, honestly. I thought it'd be nice to have the last little bit of skirt hanging open, and I think I'm very happy with that choice. And then you just peel the tape away, and it doesn't affect the stitches at all. It just peels away from the stitches, I think because you sort of cut the tape as you're doing it, so, and it's super easy. Fantastic. So now we're just cutting over to the plaid skirt. So kind of switching gears again, sort of similar way to what we did in cutting. And you can see I just basted in that pleat yet again. So this time I'm just making sure that's lined up and all pinned in place. And we just have one big front panel to work with. As I said, I basically cut 2 of the back of the skirt. So this omits that whole button situation. And then I'm going ahead and I'm just sewing my pockets on. These pockets is actually my personal pocket pattern, which I'm hoping to put out very shortly. So let me know if you'd be excited to see that, because this is a pocket pattern that I've been developing for a really long time. So this is my personal giant pocket pattern that I'm using here to use as my inseam pockets. But you could, of course, use any of your favorite pocket patterns. But I went ahead and stitched it onto the side, both sides of my skirt. And then, of course, we are doing some understitching. Do not skip the understitching when you're putting in inseam pockets. That is the thing that makes your pocket poof out and be really terrible when it comes out of the wash. So don't do that to yourself. Save yourself the pain and actually understitch your pockets. And then the other painful thing I'm doing is going ahead and lining up my plaid. So I'm going through and using kind of the crosses in the plaid where the plaid kind of crisscrosses itself there, like the corners, and using that as a guidepost for lining up my plaid all the way along my side seam. So keeping that all in place so that actually when I wear the skirt, it'll look like kind of the nice chevrons on the side. So again, if you're doing something simple, it's that kind of attention to detail. Like this skirt is technically like 2 front panels and 4 pocket pieces and a couple of waistbands. So, that attention to detail where it's just like match up your side seams really helps, and it really makes it look like a high end for an easy project, I think. So, but we are going ahead and we're going to pivot right at that point where my stitching meets my original stitching from putting the pocket on, and then going all the way along the side seam. So satisfying, matching all that plaid up. I've done this a few times. It does take a little practice to line up all that plaid, to be honest. Like I've done it a few times now and I get better every time I do it. So, it's just like patience more than anything. Find yourself a good podcast. Or a good YouTube video, of course. You could watch my lovely YouTube videos or listen to them. I would love that. But I'm just going ahead and basting everything in place as well at the top. So basting that pocket onto the waistband so it's out of my way. You want to fold your inseam pockets towards the front. That always is the most comfortable because your hands don't point backwards. Just a tip. I've made that mistake more than once. And then we get into pinning on the waistband. So the waistband isn't going to match the plaid perfectly, but what I tried to do here was actually match the plaid up in the center. So I matched that blue stripe going all the way down the middle for my waistband, and then it slowly kind of doesn't match up as it goes towards the side, if that makes sense. So on the front and back, that's the way it works, which again, kind of a nice detail. I think it's really elongating to have the plaid work like that, where it's still in that vertical. There you can see it totally unfolded. So that gives you an idea of how it matches up. Like it matches up nicely in the center there and then slowly doesn't match. But again, I think it's a really nice look. I think it's really lengthening. I think if you wanted to really break it up, like say if you had a really long torso or something, you could of course have the plaid running the opposite direction, and that would kind of break up the line, if you will, like a belt would. So here's that band roll stuff that I was talking about. So this is kind of a specific waistband interfacing. I've been getting mine at Wawak in big rolls, but I just went ahead and sewed it to my seam allowance on the front half of my skirt. I didn't put it in the back half because we're going to be doing that elastic again. But if you didn't want to do the elastic, you could of course carry it all the way around and use a zipper. But the advantage of this is it keeps your waistband really crisp and it doesn't collapse. So if you, like me, sit in an office all day and like sit in your desk all day, this prevents that kind of waistband crinkling collapse from happening, so that when you go to stand up, your waistband doesn't look like garbage. So absolutely wonderful. So here I am top stitching from the other side. I'm actually using a stitch in the ditch foot. That's what that weird black thing is at the end of my foot. This is super useful for doing waistbands, and it's one of the few times I changed my feet, obviously. And I'm using the edge of that band roll to stitch it in place, which again, this is actually really easy and beginner friendly way of doing this. So would recommend it. And then I've left a little gap here in the back. So I'm just feeding my elastic through. So this is how I usually do my waistbands, where I feed this elastic through. And then I actually go ahead and try the skirt on, and I'm able to customize how tight this elastic is. I think this is still my favorite method. With the corners and that of doing the other one with the buttons, I think it did make sense to do it the other way, just because it did give me nice crisp corners and everything like that. But this method really does allow me to customize the elastic. So I'm going to go ahead and just pin this down here, and I'm going to sew up the one side, I believe. Just the one side. Oh yeah, I'm just like making sure the elastic's nice and even in there. Just making it sure it's nice and even in my channel. And then I'm actually going to leave, you can see the tail of the elastic hanging out on the side there. So I'm just pinning it in place how tight I think it needs to be for now. And I'm actually going to go ahead and just sew the one side. And then I'm going to go off camera and try this on and just make sure that's as tight as I want it. And of course, you know, that means I can just unpin the other side and figure out how tight it needs to be before I go ahead and chop off the elastic and throw the rest and the excess away in my elastic bin, hopefully, is where I put that. And then I'm going to take that stitch in the ditch foot again and just sew up that gap. So it does require a little bit of back and forth as well, but you know, it allows you a bit more flexibility. I also think it's good too, because if you do, like, I don't know, say lose a few pounds or something, gain a few pounds, you can go in pretty easily and fix the elastic. So, I don't know, a couple of different thoughts for you. So now we get into the dueling screens. I thought this was a little bit of fun. This is another thing from Wawak. This is a bias hem facing is what this is. So it's just like a wide bias tape is essentially what this is. And you get a huge roll of it for like $12. I think it's like something obscene, like 30 or 50 yards for $12. And I've absolutely been in love with this stuff. If you've been following for a really long time, if you're an OG, you'll know I used to actually cut fabric and make giant bias tape like this, but the Wawak stuff is so much cheaper than that, and it's pre-done, so I might as well use it, to be honest. And I actually don't even mind, like, it's a 50 poly cotton blend. And so it actually adds a lot of stiffness to the hem of the skirt. And again, avoids me ironing my hems, which I really deeply enjoy because I hate ironing my stuff. And inevitably, I'm trying all the things that I can do to make myself not look like a crinkled mess in the morning while doing the minimal amount possible. That's the goal, right? Non-crushable waistband, non-crushable hem. Basically, like, you give it a good shake and you're good to go. So what I'm doing here is actually connecting my bias facing here. So I'm actually connecting it on the bias to continue that bias pattern around the skirt. This is a bit extra. Sometimes I do it, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I just cut it straight on a side seam. But for this one with this lightweight fabric, I was trying to maintain that bias so that it's basically like a continuous bias piece all around the skirt. And then went ahead, ironed it flat, and guess what we're doing again? Understitching! Don't you guys love understitching? Dueling cameras, understitching galore. So again, this gives you a crisp waistband and holds that in so that you don't see that white one unless you want to see it, which I think is a nice detail. You can, of course, get these in different colors, or you could, again, cut your own to match your fabric. I kind of like the peak of white. I kind of, the Saint Fleur ones with the white. I have a really ancient video on making a Saint Fleur skirt, so I'll leave that up above. But, that peak of white, I really don't mind it on most of my stuff. I think it's kind of a cute detail, but, you do you. It also comes in, like, flaming red if you really wanted to make it, like, a whole detail. I've thought about doing that. But, as you can see, it's a little bit wibbly when I'm first trying to iron it down, and I'm actually using some hovering steam from the iron, and that just helps to kind of steam it in place. It can take quite a bit of steam. Sort of depends mostly on your fabric underneath, but you can see that little bit of wibble where, it's shorter on one side and longer on the other, as a circular hem will be, but it presses really easily out. You can see all those wibbles basically come out and it becomes nice and smooth. Just with a little bit of steam, a little bit of iron. I don't find that I've ever had to gather it by hand and then put it on, like I think a lot of places suggest. I just, have my steam setting on high and it seems to work out fine and nice and smooth and flat, and I've never had any problems with it. So I'm just going ahead and sewing it directly on. My original plan for these dueling cameras was that I was going to do a blind hem on one and a regular on the other, but it turns out this actually has kind of too small of a seam allowance for that, so I've decided to just go ahead and sew them both on, straight on. I actually think this is fine. You can't really see it on either skirt, so I think it's lovely. So here we are. I am showing you all my lovely skirts here. I am really happy with how both of these turned out, actually. This is the happiest I've been with some projects in a while. Of course, I love making skirts. It's one of my favorite things to make, and it's just like so satisfying when you're done, and I seem to get the most amount of wear out of them. This navy one, I love the styling of this. This is pretty much exactly what I wanted to have happen with this fabric. My only regret is basically that elastic, that it's not as tight as I would like it to be, just because I did that other method of construction. But honestly, I'm just gonna take out a couple of inches somewhere and it'll be fine, and put it back together and tighten up my elastic. But other than that, I absolutely love it. I think I'm going to get the most wear out of this one than everything. And then, of course, my plaid one is fantastic. It is the summer, and I feel like it feels a little fall, so maybe it's not the perfect thing for right now, but it is a really cute skirt. It's got a nice drape to it, and I think it's going to look really delightful with all my fall sweaters and things. So I'm looking forward to getting some more wear out of it then. So we have basically like a summer navy and a fall navy, which probably seems kind of excessive to some people. I'm definitely going to do some more green and brown skirts coming up here shortly, but let me know what you think, and yeah, overall very happy with them.
So I hope you guys really enjoyed all my wild hacks today. Like I say, these are part of my work wardrobe, and if you haven't seen the video of me talking about my work wardrobe, please go watch the video right there. And I hope you guys have a lovely day, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye, guys!